Thanks for taking the time to download this Negotiating with the Power of Understanding live podcast, created for the Knowledge Network of Thunderbird School of Global Management. To find more information on how to be an effective negotiator, please visit Dr. Karen Walsh's online educational series on Negotiating with the Power of Understanding at knowledgenetwork.thunderbird.edu/Walsh. In this series, you'll find a variety of podcasts, online discussions, and other resources that will help you succeed in the toughest negotiations. Learn from global leaders their secrets on negotiations. Online around the world, this is Thunderbird Knowledge Network, negotiating with the power of understanding.
Hello everyone. You're here with us at the studio of Thunderbird School of Global Management in Shiny, Arizona, with our three esteemed panelists for today, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Mathis, and Dr. Almantas. We'll be talking today about trust in negotiations in the world of finance. Our three esteemed guests will be sharing their expertise here with us, expertise from the field of global banking and finance, of cross-cultural negotiations, and of the field of law. Our guest speaker today, Dr. John Mathis, is a professor of global banking and finance and the director of the Global Financial Services Center at Thunderbird. We're very lucky to have him here today. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
He's a world-renowned economist, author, and editor of several books widely used, such as Corporate Financial Management. He's highly sought after corporations, global organizations, and the media around the world, including ourselves, for his global perspective and expertise related to the finance and banking industry and the current economic and financial crisis. Before joining Thunderbird, Dr. Mathis was a senior portfolio officer at the World Bank International Financial Corporation, and he was a senior financial analyst with the World Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We have him here today with us to talk about a rather unusual topic, the trust in negotiations in the financial world. Dr. Karen Walsh, that you most probably already know from our previous podcasts, is also a professor at Thunderbird, specializing in negotiations, cross-competency, and emotional intelligence, with over 30 years of experience in various businesses and academic contexts. She's the author and editor of several publications and has recently wrote a book that I highly recommend for any business person, Seize the Sky, 9 Secrets of the Negotiation Power. Last but not least, we have here with us Gediminas Almantas, that I'm sure you already remember. He's an industrial PhD fellow and negotiation advisor. Examples of his experience include positions such as president of the Swiss and Baltic Chamber of Commerce in Lithuania, and he has served there for 8 years, and attorney at law, managing partner in a law firm in Lithuania, and freelancer at the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. He's coming here from us from Copenhagen Business School. Thank you all for being here with us today. So let's start. I'm just going to bring up the definition of trust in literature. So trust is opening yourself for a risk. Dr. Mathis, let's start with you. How do you start negotiating? How do you start with people? Do you trust or mistrust at the beginning of a negotiation?
That's a good question. I think if in finance in particular, if you do not trust people, you do not negotiate. So the part of the first challenge in either reviewing an investment or determining I'm going to let somebody use my money or manage my money, the issue is, do I trust them? And, I just walked out of a portfolio meeting here a few minutes ago, and we were trying to make a decision about whether we buy into a portfolio of stock, a couple companies. And obviously the first thing we look at is, well, who's the owner? Who's the CEO? What is their background? What is their experience? Do they know the business? How long have they been in that position? Who were they with, previously? So you do a background check to make sure that there is an element of trust. I mean, money is what you work very hard for, and to let somebody use and manage it, you want to make sure that they are trustworthy. And in banking in general, I've spent 30, 35 years in banking, and what happens is if somebody gets on the blacklist, they are permanently blacklisted by all banks. And whether it's an individual who's an employee that does something incorrect, or Whether it's somebody who's borrowed money from the outside and has deceived or not been honest, not revealed things, then you permanently cross them off the list of doing business with. So trust is extremely important in finance.
So what about performance, though, in the current financial crisis? What about if someone in the financial world is not performing? What about this type of situation?
Not performing because of trust or abilities or?
I mean, even financial giants have failed in the current times. I mean, it's obviously not performance or abilities. It's because, I mean, perhaps they made some wrong judgments for the future, or for whatever reasons. I'm not talking about situations that somebody has been unethical, but situations that things didn't go as they predicted. So how do you think someone like a CFO or a minister of finance could rebuild this trust for the market and for the investors?
I think that's a good question in the sense that we've had Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and a number of that are pretty major companies get themselves in the difficulty. The interesting thing is if you do a background check on those companies, they didn't have the best record. They took advantage of a lot of people. Maybe they didn't do things that were illegal, but they had a reputation of being very uncooperative, very, would not treat you fairly in a transaction, would take advantage of you anytime they had the opportunity to do that. And so when you went into the financial crisis, the movement, banks, financial institutions, very heavily dependent on being able to have access to lots of money overnight. And that's the first source of money that then disappears. I don't want to give multiple billions of dollars to you on an overnight basis because, you were never nice to me. You took advantage of me. You were always, I thought, gouging me. And so the first person on my list to cut off that I don't trust anymore is going to be you. And that happened to Bear Stearns. It happened to Lehman Brothers. Those two institutions had a notorious reputation. And the outcome of that is they're gone. There is no second chance. There is no rebuilding. Now, you might say, some say Goldman Sachs was the same kind of institution. I think the difference there is, yes, Goldman Sachs is tough to deal with, but you know that the people there are experts. They are at the top of the field, and therefore they will, it's not that you don't trust them, it's almost that you admire them, that they are so intelligent to be able to figure out alternative ways of doing things. And the alternative ways is Goldman Sachs is really a unique company in the sense that it creates new products. And that creativity, innovation, buys them additional trust. Even if they are not perfect, no one's perfect, but the rationale of in a price boom recognizing that everyone can't be on the same side buying this entity. So they've been through this before, but to think about coming up with a hedge against a continuous rising price, which is a natural thing. The investment club I was with this morning, we own Apple. And Apple has been going up very dramatically. And at some point you say, well, is it up too much? Is it overvalued? And I think, Goldman, it goes that way back and forth. And so, but there's a respect for Goldman that buys it additional leeway, additional trust. And I think that's important. They've earned that additional trust.
Just wanted to comment that this aligns very well with what we're doing in negotiation research. And what you've just discussed here is the distinction between trust. We're measuring trust in negotiation, and we're also measuring trustworthiness. And every negotiator is always investing in their trustworthiness. And what you've just shown us is that when there's not a continual investment in that, that your reputation and the trust in you and your trustworthiness can actually melt away. And it's very hard to build back up. So anybody in the finance industry or any industry who's doing a negotiation is either investing in building that social capital, that trustworthiness, which is ultimately going to be the glue to keep the negotiators to get a movement toward agreement. So this is a very good example, and we've got a lot of good test cases to show how important it is to keep investing in your trustworthiness and what that means within each industry or even cultural context. That these things can be measured. And the work we're doing in measuring social capital, for example, are things now that we can actually show have high impact on financial returns and the financial bottom line.
That's interesting.
I just want to add some comments from the legal perspective. And I believe that the lawyer's contribution to building trust in a negotiation or even in a financial world is probably the lowest. The mandate from the customer usually is to start from the distrust situation. That means you don't really trust other party, and you put all potential risks you see or you may see or you just may imagine on the table and fix them in a contract later. That's what we observe in the legal world, complicated contracts. And the main aim actually of those complicated contracts is to lower the risk and build trust with the legal instruments. But what we see and what we observe is actually next step usually is a litigation process based on those complicated contracts. So trust is not there even with the complicated contracts. So lawyers play probably an adverse role in the trust building process in negotiation.
And I think that's kind of right. I'm not sure there's very many people that trust lawyers, although they feel a necessity to use them. And the lack of trust is because of a language issue. And the more difficult the documentation, the less you understand what is being said. And this is also perfect example in the finance industry. This morning, coming in on the radio, they had a story about the number of fraudulent finance entities that are cropping up to try to help people restructure their loans where the value of the mortgage exceeds the value of the home. And there are government entities that do this free. Well, all of a sudden, and they related to a husband and wife outfit that started offering to do this, and they charged $3,000 to $5,000. And who do they pick on? Low-income people, usually Spanish-speaking people that, you know, their understanding, comprehension of finance may be low. The financial literacy in the U.S. in general is low. And that creates for an awful lot of errors in the process of making financial decisions. And I think, you know, with respect to the subprime loan crisis that we had, this lack of understanding intelligence about finance and what you're truly getting into, you tend to be much more dependent on the banker and the person who's talking to you. And if you're the banker and you're telling me this is good for me and this will help me, and I don't understand all the terminology and complication, I mean, I'm looking at you, and there's a funny line that happens where people become so dependent on you being honest and truthful, and they get lost in asking questions and pushing it. They don't know what to ask. Are you going to take care of me? I mean, is what it ends up being, as opposed to what does that mean, you know, and what are the implications if this happens? What are the downsides, you know, of this? And they don't know how to pursue the downside question. And so it becomes a person-to-person trust. And a book I recommend for all people to get familiar, particularly graduate students or even younger, to get familiar with finance, is The Richest Man in Babylon. And The Richest Man in Babylon tells a story about how you create financial independence for yourself at a very young age, and basically you're supposed to save 10% of everything you earn and pay it to yourself, and then use this to put it to work so you get others to work for growing that 10% into your retirement or whatever it is. And in the story process, they talk about a man who was doing this, and he was saving 10%, and he gave it to a bricklayer to go buy some precious stones. And you can very quickly see the problem. What does a bricklayer know about precious stones? And this is that, I think you're the banking expert. I think I trust in you because I don't know anything about banking. I mean, the bricklayer, you know, and jewelry business maybe is more obvious, but finance is a very complex area, and it has terminology that makes it difficult to understand what's going on. And therefore, that sense of trust, it almost takes on a different meaning. It becomes a feeling, a gut feeling, a need, a desire. You know, why do you buy lottery tickets? You know, it's a nice way to get money, but you know, when it comes down to personal finance, there is that desperate need for somebody to help them make their situation better. And so the outcome of the article this morning, or the news story, was this couple has defrauded many people of $3,000 to $5,000, and there's no recourse, and you can't stop them. So you know, what happens is, in the area of finance, it's very easy for people to come in and befriend you and commit a fraudulent act.
This is why the work that I'm doing regarding power in negotiation is so interesting to me, because what I have noticed, and something I work with executives and with graduate students with, and now reaching out more to the general population, is how so much of building trust has to do with really knowing who you are and do you trust yourself. The kind of judgment and discipline and discernment that you need to learn and understand about yourself. Why would you give your power over to a banker and you don't really know what you need, what you want, what your even spiritual values are, what you're willing not to give up? And once you give that dependency up and you think you're going to build that trust with someone else before you've really understood who you are and what your goals are, or even what your needs are, and what are your value systems, I find that those are the people who basically get taken and basically often come back and say, I've been manipulated, because they didn't do their own work in terms of finding what are some of their own values and what is driving them and what they're looking for in an advisor in terms of meeting their particular needs. So much of what I call power is how much you can have a sense of discernment and judgment about yourself before you start to hand that over to somebody else to manage your needs, to manage your finances, especially in that particular area.
And particularly with low-income people that don't have the knowledge base, you know, that they're desperate. Their
Right.
downside is minimal,
Right.
you know, from maybe our perspective, but from their perspective, it's life or death for them.
Exactly.
And so they come with this lack of knowledge. You know, it's almost like they should bring a third party with them. Somebody who doesn't get so emotionally tied up into the decision, right?
Exactly. That's the discernment I'm talking about, right? And I have seen in the work that we're doing, we're reaching more to the bottom of the pyramid in terms of education. So much of education has been at that exclusive high education level. And what we're finding, these same tools can be used at the bottom of the pyramid. And we're working with people who generally have very little structural power. But these minor corrections in terms of looking at how much power they do have, if they just have a better sense and define who they are, they can manage with very little resources and very little structural authority. And that's really powerful and empowering to see.
And then for those people at the lower end of the pyramid, they should bring in an attorney, a third-party voice in just translating what this means and so forth. And oftentimes people think attorneys are extremely expensive, and you know. But on the other hand, for a couple $100, you know, with an hour period, it's the best advice they can do. The other interesting thing is at the top of the pyramid, you also have a situation where the person knows, understands exactly what's going on, may have created the product, extremely knowledgeable, and all of a sudden they have an opportunity to do a big deal. And the big deal is, yeah, they know the downside, but they're so focused on the big return, the big reward, they're willing to take the risk. And this is interesting because this is what the news and writers, reporters have focused on in the subprime loan crisis. Doesn't happen very often. It happened actually very seldom in the financial crisis. But there were a couple of these people that took an inordinate amount of risk because they only saw the upside, even though they were knowledgeable. And they wanted that upside for whatever reason, and that clouded their judgment. And they lost their perspective, lost their trust, lost their understanding of what they were doing.
Exactly, and that's why I think that grounding and going back to that discernment and judgment about what your value system is, when these opportunities present yourself, and I think Gediminas knows more about this in terms of ethics in general, but it's the same principle. You've lost focus of who you are and what you believe in and what you're willing to do when these opportunities come up.
I think that the question of part of society that is in particular vulnerable, as you have mentioned, they have not enough knowledge, or they have not enough experience in finance or in law, is a best example how the lawyers have lost the confidence, or how let's say how lawyers supposed in this situation lawyers supposed to serve them or help them to establish the trust in the system. Trust in the regulation. Regulations are objective, so they are not subjective. Everybody has subject to the same regulations. That's the law. But in fact, law, with a current situation of over-regulating, has lost its initial purpose of guiding the behavior of people. Now law is a business. We can say lawyers do a business in their field because the other people don't understand what's going on in this field, and they misuse it. So there's another element of legal ethics that's a higher ethical standards that are applicable for lawyers, and this concept should kind of prevent from misuse of the special knowledge, let's say. But it's not working, and it's really surprising what we observe now. The lawyers as that actually should serve for the establishment and maintaining trust in the society. Trust in the system and trust in the regulation, it just goes another way. How we they actually, their role is how you can overcome certain regulations, how you can avoid certain requirements to be fulfilled, and it's really strange situation. Then who can you trust at the end in a system if you cannot trust the system itself?
That's an interesting point. I'm in the process of working with a number of people to put together a program that's called the Ronald Reagan Centennial Seminar, and it has the former president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, coming to make a presentation because he negotiated with Ronald Reagan in ending the Cold War. And part of the purpose of the seminar is to talk about Ronald Reagan's leadership skill and how he was able to negotiate in situations and win, come to a settlement, whereas today we seem to have Congress that is falling apart and politicians can't speak to each other, they can't stand each other. It's become and actually the populace can't stand politicians either. I mean, the ratings on Congress is miserable in the United States. And in the process of doing this, one of the panelists that I have, who has been a politician all of his life in the Reagan White House, he said, you know, today politicians see their position as a politician as their primary source of income and as a lifetime source of income. And so what happens for politicians that find themselves into that situation? He says, partly the system demands this and requires this, but what happens is they focus more on job retention rather than the interest that they had when they first took the job to do right and so forth. Well, once a politician is trying to sell you that he should or she should remain in a position, as opposed to talking to you about, you know, some problem that you want to deal with in society, correct, or whatever, all of a sudden the dynamics change, and I think the trust issue in terms of those politicians dissipates. They're selling you something, and they're selling it too hard, and it sounds like it's too good to be true that this person is going to be able to do that. So you lose confidence in politicians in general. Not that they're all like that, but a number of them are like that today. And so you have a real problem identifying those that, you know, can do good and those that are just trying to keep themselves employed.
So let me ask you a last question for today. Do you believe that you can actually achieve a win-win situation in the financial world or the political world?
I think so. I mean, the financial world has a number of products that, you know, very important products where both parties in the negotiation win. They both do better as a result of participating and using a particular product. I think that is very definitely possible in finance, but both people have to speak the same language. I think there should always be a third party, neutral third party in the discussion, and you know, to help at least, maybe not early on in the discussion, but before the decision is made, to bring some sort of, you know, remind the individual about why they're here, what their objectives were, what their values were, and so forth. Because in the heat of the discussion, sometimes you lose perspective. You get to focus on what the individual is saying and how it sounds rather than what are the cold, hard facts and purpose that you walked in the meeting for.
What is your...
Yes, I think win-win is possible, but I think it comes back to exactly what you've been saying and we've been talking about here. A lot of it has to do with preparation, and that it takes some discipline, and it takes judgment and discernment about all of these things. And it means that you need to take accountability and to take responsibility for your interaction in that process. And a lot of it has to do with mindset, that when we live in a world of limited resources and limited budgets, if we look at the situation as a scarcity situation, we are going to come at it with a win-lose attitude. But the more that you can develop trust and invest in your own trustworthiness and find others that are trustworthy, then you can move into that phase of creating lots of creative options. And you've said a lot about innovation and creativity, and alternatives are possible when the parties can trust each other and they can build an environment that they can expand the resources, share the resources, and actually produce more resources than actually were there at the front end. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, the mindset. And we take responsibility for that.
And the message there from a finance standpoint is never walk into a situation where you're in a desperate mood.
You're speaking my language.
Good. And we didn't rehearse this. Desperate in the sense of, you know, you're broke, you're running out of money, somebody has become unemployed, you just can't carry this beautiful house you bought, you know, whatever it is, or the company's revenue is falling and you're begging, you're pleading, you know, at that stage, you lose your sense of who do I trust, who do I not? I'm so desperate, I need to do it. And maybe go back to some of the parables that are in this, the richest man in Babylon, and he talks about gaining a sense of financial independence by paying yourself 10% of what you earn and keeping that in an account, just to retain your sense of logic and your ability to not become desperate in the negotiation situation. It gives you the upper hand. You realize you can always walk. And as long as you realize you have the freedom to walk and not agree or disagree, just walk because you don't know, then you're in the upper hand. You think more clearly, and you become more comfortable asking the difficult questions.
That 10% concept for me sounds like a BATNA in a negotiation. You have a BATNA and you create it for yourself. Having it is always as a walk-away position and walk-away point if whatever happens. And I think it's really clever. Like all the negotiation science, they promote the BATNA concept. Like, don't go to any negotiation without your BATNA. So 10% is your BATNA you have always with you in a pocket. So.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify, those of us who use BATNA a lot, this jargon we
Yes,
use
I would like-
in
yeah,
negotiation,
great.
it means having a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So if you go into a negotiation and things don't work out well, and you go beyond your tripwire of your bottom line of what you're willing to give up or you're not able to get, then you have this alternative to go to. And you always have a source of power. And it's important for us to actually have that in place before we begin, just as you said. And it's also useful for us to know that the other party may or may not have a good BATNA. The banks, the loan officer, they're all trying to build a reputation and get accounts. So they also have a lot at stake as well. For us to understand that maybe their BATNA or alternative is not very good, that puts us in a pretty good situation too. We always have more leverage than we think. And this is something we know from the research, is that we always have more leverage than we think we do. So a lot of it is about perception and about preparation and actually scanning the environment with a lot more perspective, just as you've said.
If I may still add a legal opinion to a win-win situation, I probably play here a role of devil's advocate, but I would say from the legal perspective, win-win situation not really exists, or they are not familiar with that. And in my opinion, that comes from the typical classical legal education in the sense of litigation. In a court, it's usually win-lose. It's you actually observe in very few cases a win-win situation. It's either guilty or not guilty. It's either right or wrong. And in probably a common law system like in the US allows certain settlements without a final court decisions, which is not so popular and not so typical in Europe, where usually it ends up in one or another way. So talking about win-win situation with lawyers is also educational process, and lawyers should get it, like understanding that in a business, win-win situation is much better than win-lose case.
And then the message that I hear from that is, don't count on luck providing you safety, security, or what you want. And at least not in the sense of buying a lottery ticket or taking inordinate amount of risk because your desperation is so bad that you need to do that. And don't think that people that are well off or wealthy or admired in the city or town got there because of luck. They got there because of knowledge about what the issue was and applying that knowledge to the situation. They got there by doing homework and studying, to your point, about the situation before they walked into it. And if their knowledge was limited, get some professional help to improve their knowledge before they walk in. And a lot of people don't do that. They walk in and oftentimes expect the bank to provide the education for them. And the bank may, but they don't understand it because it may be too complex. Or they may just not want to hear it. And therefore, they're trusting the individual and maybe to take care of them. And that's like buying a lottery ticket. The individual the lottery is not going to take care of you. The odds are against you to win, whether you go to the gambling table or whatever. Luck just does not happen. You create luck by having an understanding and knowledge about what it is you're going to pursue, what it is you want. You study about it, you learn about it, you learn what questions to ask, and that's how you create luck.
Just one final comment on that is one of the areas I'm very interested is predatory negotiators and predatory negotiation environments. And what you've just said actually creates an environment for people to become preyed upon. And the real source of power then comes to the individual to take responsibility and accountability for what they need and to identify what's happening. And this is where I think law does help. It's a very rights-based approach to negotiation, that if my rights are being violated and I am vulnerable in this predatory environment, the rights are there. The legal process is there to protect us. But for a win-win situation, we're looking at interests. How can our self-interest be met in a equal or mutual way? Then we don't need to use the rights-based strategy or the law to protect our rights when we are being violated or somebody is actually overstepping the bounds of what is appropriate or what is ethical in that situation.
And I think there's a new challenge that has come about because of the internet. And there are a lot of things on the internet that are flashed up before you that, you know, snippets that you read and boy, that sounds good. And you only end up finding out that it is totally untrue. You see this to some extent in newspapers and how items are reported. And you almost come to the situation where you can't trust what you read in words from marketing, from advertising, or from the newspaper, because it is the representation of an individual's commentary or somebody who's trying to sell a product telling you something. And again, the low-income person is most exposed because of lack of education, lack of knowledge, or lack just of how do I find out about this? How do I learn about it before I go ahead and jump? But also a failure on the part of regulations to stop these fraudulent statements, activities. I mean, not, at least now in the political debates going on in the U.S., we have a fact check. You know, where somebody can interrupt and call out fact check to try to, you know, get the truth of the story. And in a way, that's kind of a legal checks and balances on what people say. That doesn't happen on the internet. And, you know, a lot of good things about the internet, but unfortunately, a lot of abuse comes about because of the internet.
Right.
Great. Okay. Let me take some last points here. So with financial products, we can actually have a win-win situation in the business world in general and protect everyone's interests. First of all, we need to make sure that we speak the same language, we understand the complexities. Preparation is very important before we go and negotiate and understand a product. We need to companies need to invest in trustworthiness throughout their performance. To be creative is an important thing that increases trustworthiness in businesses, as well as the historical performance and being respectful in the way they're doing business. From the perspective of the individuals, they should be prepared, understanding your power before you go to a negotiation. Understanding the BATNA, as we learned today, is critical, so that you are not desperate when you're going there and you can walk away from a negotiation if that doesn't work for your interests, is critical. And perhaps not depending on just luck is important, and every information we can find on the internet. Thank you very much for being here with us. It was great having you, and thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Online around the world, this is Thunderbird Knowledge Network, negotiating with the power of understanding.